At the university, at the Students' Union, I became involved in the main environmental organization of the day, Save Tomorrow Post Pollution, or acronym called STOP. One of the first tasks I undertook was to create a coalition of lawyers and scientists to initiate at least one lawsuit. It actually turned out to be 5 lawsuits in the end, against what is today Suncor, but what was then the Great Canadian Oil Sands, GCOS, Great Canadian Oil Sands, that's what it was, for violations on environment. And I spent 6 years of my life engaging in that process and seeing the lawsuits through the courts, testing the environmental laws, and actually testing, perhaps in a way, testing what can be done about multinational corporations. And I think in that process, there was a need to develop a relationship with the union, or the union that was closest to production at GCOS, so that we could gather evidence, what was happening, the process. That would have been the Atomic Energy Union at the time. Oil Chemical Atomic Union. And with them, they actually guided our way. And the Stockholm Conference led many governments, and including Canadian governments, as well as the provincial governments, to institute their first departments of environment. And then the big struggle after that was to get those departments to institute environmental legislation. Alberta introduced the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Land Surface Reclamation Act, the Water Resources Act, a number of other very significant pieces of legislation. But especially on the crucial ones were especially the Clean Water Act and the Clean Air Act of Alberta at that time. They were very, very, very weak. There were standards, but it was basically self-reporting. And it was ruled by, what is it in English, when it requires the approbation of cabinet to institute an order in council. It was basically management by order in council. And the weak and the standards were very, very low. Now that's the point of history that I come in to stop. The department has been created, the law has been established. Now we're at the stage of realizing that all this decade of work has been not very fruitful because the legislation is so weak. So the focus of my involvement and the intervention of STOP was to highlight the deficiencies of the law. That was the purpose. And we then engaged in this big campaign, which ultimately lasted 8 years, to test the law using various legal mechanisms and launch a lawsuit against the Great Canadian Oil Sands. In the end, we launched 8 lawsuits against the company. And all of them, I think, were all under either the Clean Air Act of the day or the Clean Water Act of the day. And they were, just to give you just one sense, one of them was directed against the GCOS tailings dike. And by the way, the reason we picked the GCOS company, first of all, they were the first ones there. And also that the technology since GCOS has not changed, really. Syncrude and the companies coming up forward now are really talking about the same level of technology, with higher levels of efficiency, but not much. I think all they're doing is talking about scale. The scale of the operations. And so we knew that what we would reveal about GCOS, we would reveal about the inherent contradictions and problems with the development of tar sands generally. Now, just to give you one example, we launched a lawsuit under the Clean Water Act because GCOS was, through its drainage pipes at the base of the tailings pond, were dumping 400,000 gallons of acutely toxic material into the Athabasca River a day. It took 2.5 years to gather the evidence and information. And when we arrived in court, that particular session lasted it lasted a full week. But and we presented the evidence, and the only thing the company did was to introduce a worker that lived in the Fort McMurray area that worked for the company, and he testified that he had fished along the river for many years of his life, and his children fished, and at no time during that time did they ever catch a dead fish. And on the basis of that, defense, the company was found not guilty. And that ended that case. But they had all of the charges that we laid have similar stories, and it really revealed the weakness of the legislation of the law. And I think we gave birth to a new generation of environmentalists, because thereafter several years, when I look at how things evolved, first of all, there was a heightened interest in environmental law, and you'd have a lot more environmental lawyers, young lawyers that were interested in environment and developing that area. And I think about 7 or 8 years, there was another round of legislation. There were, by the way, there was a round of legislative amendments that followed, but the law was still not strong, and there was another round among a new generation of environmentalists, and the story continues until we have the Great Canadian Tar Sands today, with not much stronger laws, and still the inherent technical problems that still exist at the GCOS site. And I went to work in Bolivia with the Tin Miners Union, with the hope that, first of all, because I knew that would broaden my scope, but also it kind of tied the knot with respect to working with the union. And the Bolivian Tin Miners Union have a long struggle in the tin mines. And whereas in Canada, I developed my intellectual framework for union organizing and commitment, in Bolivia, it strengthened my psychological commitment to the union movement and also to progressive change.
Okay. Just talk very briefly then, if you can, or as long as you want, about what you did in Bolivia. What you did, what you saw, what you concluded, okay?
Well, at the time, Bolivia was managed by a right-wing military dictatorship, the Banzer regime. It was also the time of very, very rapid expansion in the Amazon part of the jungle. Actually, the Amazon, if you look at a map, the Amazon actually begins in the high levels of Bolivia and Ecuador. And there was really high levels of migration into those newly developed areas. Basically, what I saw was heavy duty slash and burn. And I think I was near the beginning edges of massive destruction of forest for promoting primarily mineral development in Bolivia. It was also, tin is a metal, and it's a strategic metal from a military point of view. And the United States government, right after the First World War, stockpiled, I don't know how much tin, but they stockpiled a considerable amount of tin and kept their stashes in 3 different places in the world, but almost always bought the tin from Bolivia. And what they would do is they would control the price of tin by when the Bolivian government or the Bolivian employers in tin threatened to raise the price of tin, the United States would dump their own reserves of tin on the market and to depress the prices. And that had horrific impacts for the workers. the workers at Yagagua, which was the biggest tin mine, the oldest tin mine in the world, went on strike because the employer just wasn't giving in terms of increasing the wages. Now I'm talking about wages from starvation wages to less starvation wages. And literally they were starvation wages. Anyway, my role, I had been in the country for 5 months, but before I went to Bolivia, I stopped in Mexico to study Spanish. And intensive Spanish, you're not bad after a month and a half. 5 months I was functioning in my Spanish, and I was able to interact. I had a Canadian passport, and because I had a Canadian passport, I was free to travel within the country without hindrance, whereas the Bolivians were not. They had to cross many military checkpoints and were questioned. And because I was able to travel, I became, I characterized myself as the go-between, the organizing committee of the strike in Yayagua, in Yayagua in the Tin Mine Center, with the one in the capital city of La Paz. And I just basically traveled back and forth, and was the agent communicateur, the communicating agent, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, I were also French.
I see, agent communicateur, and in the end, I was in Yayagua, and there were 4 of us, 4 extranjeros. 3 of them were from Europe. I was from Canada. Another one was from the UK, and both Canada and the UK were considering massive amount of money donation to Bolivia for its Bolivian tin mines. And so we were kind of treated with kid gloves, although at the end we were both arrested. And instead of other cases where we would have disappeared, we were just escorted to the airport and told to go home. We were basically kicked out of the country. Okay. And I had a Canadian passport, white boy from the north. That's all I got. But the rest that remained, I think that the people on the committee, well, I know that the people on the committee with whom I worked, especially in the tin mine centers, there were 7 of them. 6 were dead by the following years, and the last one actually died maybe 2 years after that. And they were both either massacred, they disappeared, or they died of unknown causes, so to speak. Yeah. So that then, I think I came back a very committed trade unionist. This would have been 80, 81, and the basis of my work with the trade unions were basically trade union rights problems, which are part of the same body of issues. And for the first time, by that time it was the Trudeau government. Trudeau government was debating the passage of the Charter of Rights of Canada. Is it the Charter of Human Rights? Okay, I think I'm confusing some dates, but by the time I started at the Federation of Labor, the Charter of Rights debate had not been concluded. It had been put on the table and for broad-based discussion, and the Alberta Federation of Labor decided that they were going to promote the Charter of Rights and get the trade union movement to actually support it. And that was my job. That was my first job. And there was a big debate at the time because the way the charter was drafted, it evolved into basically the recognition of the freedom of association, but without further clarification if the freedom of association incorporated the right of collective bargaining and the right to strike. What exactly did it mean? And there were factions of the trade union movement that basically argued that we should organize a campaign to defeat the introduction or the passage of the Charter of Rights, as opposed to support it. And we were among the few with the Ontario Federation of Labor to actually support it and push ahead, arguing that the very historical notion of freedom of association does incorporate it, does incorporate those other notions of collective bargaining and right to strike, and that we needed to actually do our homework with respect to that. Well, as it turns out, there were even after that period of time a long string of legal cases that eventually went up to the Supreme Court. But I think for a decade, the court actually held the view that the freedom of association does not really incorporate freedom of association or collective bargaining for 2 decades. And it took a Supreme Court decision, Canadian Supreme Court decision to turn that around. But in the end, I think that exercise for me was, first of all, I was now working for the trade union movement. And second of all, it created a floor, let's put it that way, a floor on which I was standing. That was my foundation for beginning my work at the trade union movement, on the basis of freedoms and rights and human freedom. And although I only worked in that field directly at the Federation of Labor for a year and a half or 2 years, that notion became, I guess I would say, axiomatic to everything I did after that until this day, because the freedom of workers to participate remained and continues to be fundamental. At that time, Mulroney was making moves with the United States to organize and to conclude a deal with the United States on trade. And initially, it was touted as a solution to a big problem. But we were never, the Canadian public was never really educated or sensitized to what the problem was, and never really clued in on what the solutions may entail for workers in the country, and in this case, for workers in the United States. I think the moves were by Mulroney: adopt this trade agreement, don't ask too many questions, and certainly don't expect to know very much about it, because it's really beyond the scope of the average Canadian. And there was a movement across the country, primarily, I think, sparked with activists in Ontario and the Canadian Labour Congress, that agreed with the development agencies involved, developing NGOs, that is, those organizations that were very active abroad on finding money for many different types of projects abroad, that were in Canada convinced that the only way to deal with the free trade agreement was to deal with it with the trade union movement. So there you have another national level coalition that was developed and eventually became the Pro-Canada Network. And I was the coordinator of the Pro-Canada Network in Alberta, and for the purposes of fighting the free trade agreement. Now I don't even recall how long that lasted. I think it lasted until the federal election that actually decided the fate of the free trade agreement in the end. And I left after that federal election, or just before the federal election, to go work in Brussels with the International Trade Union Confederation. What was your first question?
Talk a little bit about how the coalition
okay.
evolved.
So the coalition, the coalition, it really was primarily focused on the free trade agreement, and therefore it raised all kinds of questions about Canadian sovereignty and the Canadian power of decision making, and therefore attracted the likes of the Council of Canadians and others to join in cooperation under the roof of Pro-Canada Network, or sorry, yes, Pro-Canada Network. But the coalition, although primarily focused on free trade agreement, there were so many facets of it that were not strictly free trade. For example, the development of the forestry industry in Alberta, would be severely affected by the free trade agreement. And so then elements of the coalition wanted to focus on the institution of the Dayashawa pulp mill industry in Athabasca. And also, although the outside observer would say, well, there are so many different issues that we're working on, but in essence, they were all different facets of the same phenomenon, which is the nature of trade agreements and the nature of this particular trade agreement and what it would do. And so as the coalition grew, it also became more complex across the country, and there was also the need for. We had various coalitions in different provinces that were named differently. And there was a decision that within the coalition, within the national coalition, that we would consolidate our effort under a new name that would be like the similar name across the country for everybody. And so Canada Action Canada network was actually born. And that became the basis for. Now, recall that the Free Trade Agreement eventually was adopted in 1989, and that after that followed the debate of the NAFTA agreement to bring into scope Mexico. Now, I was already working in Europe at that time. But what was interesting is that the debates and the discussions about trade and the nature of trade have continued to flourish and become really serious now. Let's say sustainable development. I mean, there is a loose definition of it that was, put out by Gurhal and Brundtland, that was charged eventually by the United Nations to actually produce the first discussion document on sustainable development, and that definition. Without going into the actual definition, the definition really enforces the need to develop and understand critical links between problems. And one of them that remained key for me and the trade union movement was the link between environmental problems and social realities. And although the Earth Summit in 1992 focused on environment, that gave rise, well, in fact, the United Nations at that year also created what is still known as the Commission on Sustainable Development that would meet year by year. And I was, with other colleagues, went to meetings year by year, and our primary intervention from the very beginning was that this cannot only be about the environment, and it cannot be the global problems cannot only be linking social issues to the environment or linking the activities of any particular group to the environment. It was more about integrating. And the difference is that we're in Alberta, for example, we have approved a forest industry. Let's say, for example, like Dayashawa, we would ask environmental questions, but we would never raise social questions. We would never raise what social impact will this have in our community? What will be the impact on employment, the short and long term? What will be the impact on women? What will be the impact on youth? What will be the impact on Aboriginal people? These questions remained unquestioned. So that sustainable development is a framework whereby all issues become interlinked, and the solution to problems become interlinked solutions as well. And from our point of view, at the United Nations post-1992, our interventions were really that no matter what the economic activity, that the impacts of employment need to be understood prior to the execution of any decision, and the problems needed to be addressed, and addressed in real financial and economic terms, so that no activity, no environment activity or economic activity is allowed to run on its own without the full evaluation on the social impacts. And our activity stretched, well, basically for an entire 10 years until we reached the next summit, which is the 2002 summit. And that took place in South Africa. And there, for the first time, the trade union movement succeeded in making that summit a real sustainable development summit, because that summit considered not only environmental issues, but also social issues as they are linked to or integrated with economic and social issues. For us, the key issue was employment, but it broadened out in many other areas. And I think now the whole notion of sustainable development is better understood as a common approach that links all of those issues together. Now, I just want to say that since the Industrial Revolution, the trade union movement has been doing sustainable development, but it hasn't been calling it that. So that, you know, in England you had the rise of Industrial Revolution. Workers were impacted through pollution of their environment, and they reacted. And they reacted with the employer, with the government, but they were in effect doing sustainable development, but not calling it that. Okay, something does not become something unless you actually call it that. Now it's a new framework. It's not the elements are not new to the trade union movement. What is new is to put everything we do as trade unions within that framework. That is to argue with the government that the labor law needs changing, not only because workers have rights or should have rights, but also to save the problem, to save this planet from environmental destruction. There is no way that we will save it without the activities of workers at the plant site, active and engaged with their employers to identify and solve problems. Will we actually get out of this mess that we're in the world? So it's a very different approach. Now, I think in the trade union movement globally has still not come to that full realization. It's still a very small number, but the number is there. And I think that's the difference. That's the difference in perspective. Okay, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change was adopted in 1992. It wasn't until 2 years later or 3 years later that the Kyoto Protocol, which created arms and legs for the convention. Climate change was setting initial targets, setting the initial mode of operation at the international level for dealing with climate change. And I think the trade union movement was really late in its involvement on climate change. It was really not involved in the initial decision-making with respect to the convention. It was, for the most part, it was absent in the discussions. It was also absent in the adoption of the Kyoto Protocol. And because it was absent, then there was nothing, literally, or maybe a grouping of a few words in the convention that really addressed the concerns of workers and the social impacts of climate change. And so this was kind of Johnny-come-lately trying to fix the boat, trying to fix the leaky boat. This is the feeling I had when we were involved. And so the second year of the Kyoto Protocol, there were a lot of governments and there were a lot of components of society that were involved and engaged in the discussion and informed in what became a very complex debate. And in comes Lucien Royer, the sole representative of the trade union movement, a year after the Kyoto Protocol, and going to an international meeting that lasted almost 2 weeks, heavy on the resource, on the cost for the trade union movement, and for the trade union organization that wasn't convinced that I should actually be going. So that was the reality. And of course, to to go into these meetings where 4,000 or 5,000 people, you're not prepared, you don't have the resources to be prepared. It's an overwhelming experience to say, well, what can I do as an individual, but what can we do as a union movement here? What role do we have to play? And I think for 8 or 9, well, 6 or 7 years, the strategy was twofold. One was, first of all, to get more trade unionists involved in being concerned about climate change. And institutionally, this was a barrier within the trade union movement, because it meant introducing a new agenda item to the ITUC, or the ICFTU then, that didn't exist before. And quickly, very, the group that was most vociferous against our inclusion was the occupational health and safety activists, because they saw in it more focus on climate change, less on occupational health and safety. And so it was just not possible to integrate our work together when it could have happened, but it didn't happen. And so I think our main focus for 3 or 4 years was really to creating a presence of trade unions at the meetings and in the issues wherever we could, and to start talking about mainly 2 things. One was the whole question of employment transition, that governments and all the other actors involved in the debate needed to recognize that no matter what, first of all, climate change itself, but our activities to address climate change mitigation effects are both going to have enormous employment impacts, and that they needed to be addressed, and therefore the call for really sophisticated research on the issue, with a capacity to identify what areas of interventions were needed in the near future and the long future. And the second body of notions was related to green jobs. And the notion of green jobs was introduced, we introduced the notion of green jobs, I think it would have been about 6 years ago, where we started talking about that workers and employers can actually do a lot about climate change. And if only doing the simplest things of agreeing that they would mutually do an analysis of energy consumption at their plant site, and to identify the simple things, the basic low-cost things that can be done, that's the starting place that we can do. And then you go on from there to, the broader discussions that they would have, for example, in the Scandinavian countries, where workers and employers actually get together and actually work together and decide what technology is being introduced at the workplace. Now, that's a different level of discussion, but it is taking place, and we do have the capacity in the trade union movement to deal with those questions now. There's a body of... So those were the 2 main areas. Now, over the years, we went from 1 person to 5 people to 10 people to, I think last year, there were 125 trade union organizations represented at the annual meeting of the climate change. And I know that many of those now become articulate in climate change, are really, they know the background, and they know the process that is in place, and they know the repercussions. They know that trade unions, it's no longer a question whether or not trade unions are involved in the climate change issue. It's more a question of how and to what extent and what are going to be the impacts.